Hi, Laura. How's it going?
I'm well. How are you?
Just flying high from this episode. What a phenomenal woman Cassandra is. I think I say that in the beginning too, where I'm like, these phenomenal women, because
Mhm.
she is just like this pint-sized powerhouse. She's got so much information. I'm always just in awe when I listen to her.
So
What did
many,
you think?
so many quotable moments,
So many quotable moments.
right, and so many things that she mentioned, books that she mentioned, quotes that she said that I had to write down afterwards.
Oh yeah, we should totally include a couple of the books in the show notes because they're definitely must reads. I have one of them in my Amazon cart as we speak.
Yes, totally.
Um, but yes, she really spoke to a lot that moved me. She started off talking about her experiences with racism and how they started on the playground. That's something that we don't necessarily think about, how children regurgitate racist ideas and thought processes that they learn from home, because no child is innately racist, right? That's something that's a learned behavior. But how that one experience began to echo in her life,
Mhm.
how as a result of that experience that really affected her and caused her body to, and I quote, betray her, right, from the embarrassment and the pain of that experience, that she used books to escape. And
Yeah.
she used them as a way to sort of get inside of her own head and dissociate from her body.
Yeah, that really resonated with me because I feel like we can all relate to that as women of color. We kind of detach from our feelings. And something that she brought up as well, I remember very specifically happening in New York around 2014 when she was awakening to the injustices of the world with all of the focus being on Black men being, murdered by cops, the police, and how she was able to internalize that for her own work with um, you know, divesting from white dominated spaces and also her own relationship with anti-blackness.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's so funny that you brought it back to that because I was thinking how she said when I asked her relationship with anti-blackness and speaking to that within other communities, because it isn't something that is discussed, but it is something that needs to be discussed because anti-blackness exists across the world, across every culture. It's no culture is immune. Um, and she speaks to the debt of injustice, right? And how because of that, anti-blackness is used as a weapon to create separation and dissonance within the group so that we don't often come together. I mean, I had a friend who asked me, a friend who's black, who was like, where were the Asian people during this? and
Mhm,
i and I was like, well, they were there, but
mhm,
we're taught that we're separate and that no one's fighting for us, and that the racial triangulation of the Asian community. And I love that she chose those words because I didn't have language around that, but she speaks about the racial triangulation of the Asian community and how the Asian community is used to create more hunger,
yeah.
right?
Well, you brought up model minority myth, and you asked her
Hmm.
to define that, and I just felt that her answer was just so spot on, and it wasn't an accident. I feel that the focus a lot of 2020 was BLM, and then in 2021 we saw the focus on anti-Asian hate, and how the two groups are being pinned against each other by the
Hmm.
media.
I mean, you even brought up how in the news, right? The bodies that you see on the news, at least here in the New York area, in the greater New York area, attacking the Asian people are black and brown bodies.
Yeah.
But we know that that's not really the whole story at all. And
No.
even still, that speaks to the sophistication, as she says, of this of white supremacy and the way that it really sort of gets into all of our psyche. We have so much work to do collectively, you know?
Exactly. But I thought it was really interesting of how she did mention divesting in white spaces, specifically in the wellness community, and how the panorama, the panini, gave her gave her permission to kind of quietly, exit left, stage left of these spaces and create her own space. I believe she created that in 2018, but the Cosmos. But I just thought that was so interesting because myself included, I felt, I don't have enough time for all of these spaces. I want to find spaces that are very safe, and also I don't have to explain all of these topics, of
Over and over. We're
over.
constantly explaining, we're constantly doing the emotional labor. I actually have a quote from her because it speaks to that, where she says, "And I do believe this work requires all of us dismantling and rebuilding together. And I think in order for that work to feel safe and productive for historically marginalized and oppressed peoples, those who benefit from white supremacy must do the work of understanding their own trauma." And she
Mhm.
speaks to what it is to understand your own trauma. And that's when she gives some great book references, if those of you listening are curious on how that's been just bred into us, right, in different ways, right, so that the spirit of supremacy lives in all of us. It just manifests or affects us all differently.
Yes. And I really loved the example of the book. I forget the name of the book, but you'll just have to listen, of the history of violence within the white lineages. And, we always talk about being close to your ancestors and your lineages from a person of color perspective, but white people also have their own lineages that they need to look into.
The book is called My Grandmother's Hands,
Yeah.
and we'll include it in the show notes. It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Not from Amazon, because we're going to divest from Amazon.
Yes, we are.
It's a multi-layered, multi-step process,
It
but like
is.
slowly we can begin to create the
Mhm.
change that we want, and it's in small ways.
Yes, exactly. And well, from me, finally, what I found really loving about her message at the end for BIPOC people was to get rest. And that was a common theme that a lot of our guests have said, for us to do our own work of resting so that we can pass that down to our own generations and our own lineages. So I just felt like that was such a beautiful message.
Isn't that cool that that's also just kind of like a form of generational wealth, is of
Mhm.
learning how to rest, right? To not be this. I've been watching a lot and reading a lot about that, about understanding our need for rest collectively.
Yeah.
And she speaks to the organization, the NAP Ministry, that really promotes that. I'm
Mhm.
so excited for people to hear this episode. I hope they are as inspired as we are.
Yes. So here is her episode.
Mhm. Hi, team. Welcome. My name is Britt Simone Anderson, and we're here today with Cassandra Lam, who is an amazing person that I've known for quite some time, and Laura Chung, my amazing co-host and beautiful friend and phenomenal woman. Um, and these two phenomenal women that we're sitting with, that I'm sitting with, that we're in circle with together, um, are here to share. Cassandra, I've known you for a little bit now.
I
I've
think
known you for
like
a few years.
4 years, maybe. Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while. We've been through life together too, some seriously beautiful and transformative moments. And I'm honored to have you in my life, and I'm honored to get to hear your story and the way you move through the world and the way you help shape the world. Um, as long as I've known you, you've been outspoken about the injustices that we see within the BIPOC community and really across the world. Um, and you're also really driven to support um, storytelling and what it is to hear other people's story and help that shape the way we perceive the world. It's powerful at times exhausting work. Were you always this way? Was there a catalyst or an influence or someone or something that empowered you to want to hear and shift and speak up for the world at large?
Thank you for dropping us into such a tender topic, especially given where we're at in the world right now, Britt. Um, so growing up, I loved watching Sailor Moon. And Sailor Moon is, if you think about it, quite a prescient show. They were talking about astrology in the 90s, and they were talking about um, the heart of the plot is always about how love and friendship will always overcome fear and evil. And Sailor Moon's entire thing is like love and justice. Like that's her slant. And so growing up, like obviously I love the show because it was one of the few shows that really spoke to little girls. But also specifically it was a show like created in Japan based on a manga. So like as an Asian little girl who didn't see herself very much anywhere, even though Sailor Moon has blonde hair, whatever, I felt a resonance that I couldn't quite articulate. And there was just the way that they would portray the friendships among her and the other Sailor Scouts, and how it was always their friendships and love for each other and love for people that allowed them to overcome, villains and all sorts of like evil wreaking havoc in the world. So growing up and watching that was really aspirational for me to, even though at that time I didn't quite have a real definition of love. Like I don't actually think our society raises us, at least out here in America, where I have the most experience, we're not raised to understand love at the depths of to which I feel like we deserve to. Like I feel like the way that we're raised to view love in this country is actually very limiting. It's treated like a finite resource. It's very superficial, and it's very much connected to like the idea that love is ownership, or like to love you is to like own you, or um it doesn't actually honor, I think, the fullness of people. But I did see this aspirational like power of love in this TV show that I didn't quite see in my family or like replicated in the world. So I would say growing up with that as almost like something to like model after, I had my first experience of racism when I was in third grade. So I was 7 years old, and when that happened, I remember feeling really overwhelmed by like the physiological effects of emotions flooding my body. And it was actually my first racialized traumatic experience. Because that in that moment, I remember I vowed to never speak Vietnamese in public again, because that was what led to me getting criticized and or like teased by or harassed by a boy on the playground. So when that happened, I remember in that moment, like my face flushed red, the smile on my face lit off. I was gritting my teeth, trying not to cry, not to give this person the satisfaction, clenching my fists. And in that moment, I just remember feeling what I would later understand was like injustice broiling in my body, along with shame, along with fear, along with unworthiness, along with all of like doubt. Like, was something wrong with me that I attracted such a hateful interaction with just another kid on the playground? Um, so I feel like having different microaggressions, or even just like experiences of being othered and marginalized throughout my childhood, and obviously building up through teens and into adulthood, all of that always landed in my body as like registered as like injustice, and not just injustice in the sense of like, well, that sucked personally. For me, it was something that was just as intense as like the flood of emotions that would come in like this. And I would feel it as like something caught in my throat, or something in my heart pounding loud of like I need to do something with this energy um, of injustice. And obviously as a child there's very little I felt that I could do, but I do remember like all of these experiences sort of like I was racking up injustice debt, if you will, and waiting for one day to be powerful enough to have the right words, to have some way of fighting back. And so alongside all this, growing up, books were also some of my best friends. And the first time that I got to experience other worlds, I I grew up with a very strict authoritarian type of like father, um, who, you know, for him, the idea that like I might want to go hang out with my friends and stuff was just like, why would you do that? Like, you are a child and you're like living in my house and you should just be studying and you get to see them at school. Why do you need to see them at any other time? And so growing up, like going to the library was sort of a safe haven for me, because that was something that like was a that was an activity that was co-signed by my parent. And through books, I started to experience different worlds. I read a lot of like fantasy and sci-fi as a kid, also like fiction. And so I had this like voracious appetite for knowledge that like only looking back did I realize that it wasn't just that books were an escape for me. For all the ways in which I felt powerless in instances of like experiencing racism or other experiences of otherness, I started to feel like, well, my body will betray me, because my body is where I can feel shame and I can feel all like this whole rush, like anger, injustice, grief, sadness, resentment. So rather than being in my body, I'm going to live in my mind, and I'm going to fill my mind with so much fucking knowledge that one day you will feel my wrath, because I will no longer be silent. Like, for all those moments I didn't know what to say, I didn't have anything to say, and I couldn't articulate what it was that I could say to even alleviate that situation. I really started to like dive deep into knowledge and reading and academics as a means of armoring and protection. So this all like started, you know, in elementary school. And as I got older, I just really bolstered that. So I really held on to the things that I can put into my brain will protect me, because the more that I also focus on my mind, the less connected I feel to my body and the less hopefully pain I will feel. Because in fact, I was very numb for a lot of my life. Definitely a lot of my 20s. And I'm in this period right now where I'm working on resensitization and actually allowing my body, my mind to integrate. But anyways, as we fast forward to college. In college, I studied political science, which at the time, like decolonization wasn't even something people were talking about. So essentially, what I was studying was old, dead, white, Western European thinkers, and how they viewed power, which, if you think about it, is I was studying colonizers. Mm-hmm. And none of us, like, I didn't have the wherewithal to question the system, because we weren't in a moment like we were now. And definitely my family didn't have this context either. So I actually became radicalized shortly after college, because when I graduated in 2013, 2014 was the summer when Black Lives Matter was starting as a movement. I think it started on Twitter first. So this was back when we were talking about Trayvon Martin. We were also talking about George Zimmerman and like what was going to happen to him. And then a couple years later, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and these like names have stuck with me, because that period between 2014 to 2016 was when I started waking up to the reality of the world, to the injustices of the world, and seeing how the injustices that I experienced were also were like almost like a connection point to the injustices that all BIPOC are experiencing. So this is a long-winded way of saying that by the time I hit my younger 20s and going into my mid 20s, I finally had more knowledge, more language for what was going on, thanks to Black Lives Matter and thanks to the work of like social justice folks and activists who were starting to disseminate more stuff through the internet, which we also didn't have, prior. So there was more access. And so I felt like I finally had the words to start to enact on the debt of injustice that I had experienced, not only in my personal life, but that as I comb through my own personal experiences with injustice, it's almost like I was able to swap out my eyes and start to see that injustice replicated everywhere, because it's all patterns of the same systems. I'll also add, I have an Aries moon, so I am fiery. My whole natal chart is just fire and air, so like that
Me too.
lends itself well to speaking out against injustice. But I have had to be careful to not burn other people, and that's something I want to name. Like, in my journey of waking up to my racialized identity and systemic oppression and white supremacy and like the violence that is very real in the world, um, I I had to come out of like operating or trying to be someone who's advocating for change and social justice from a place of wounding, and I had to switch into a place of wholeness. And I feel like this is like probably a journey a lot of us experience, because in the beginning, when I was so wounded, I needed other people to do something or say something, like because of my wound. And so that led to me projecting a lot and hurting other people, and not honoring other people's process. Where I'm at now is recognizing that we're all on our own journey, and there's many ways to be part of the movement, and there's many ways and many roles that we need to play. But I cannot emphasize enough, like, we must be trauma informed in our work. We must be loving in how we hold each other accountable, but also how do we honor that people are moving through significant trauma, just to like awaken not only to their experience, but how their experience connects to everything else. Like, it's much more complex than my younger 20 self even knew. But with the knowledge and experience I have now, I think I bring a much softer heart to this work, and also a confidence and willingness to talk about how social justice spaces and activist spaces are also filled with white supremacist culture and ways of being. So I don't know, the discernment and the self-awareness that I've been able to cultivate through spiritual practice has been so helpful for me to question dominant paradigms, even in spaces like social justice, where it can feel so scary to question. But we must, because at the end of the day, I care more about building a world rooted in love and accountability and care than somebody's feelings. Like, our feelings, our feelings are feelings. We feel them, like we experience hurt, we experience love, we experience all these things. But at the end of the day, I don't know, I care more about harm reduction than I do about like whether or not the truth is going to hurt. Because the truth sometimes has to hurt, right? And hurt causes us to look deeper.
Mm-hmm. I love that you said that. I 100% agree and connect to so much of your experience, and how that first experience of racism, especially as a child, really shapes you. That first one that reminds you that you are, or lets you know that to the world you are different, and there's something wrong with your difference, and there's something to be ashamed about with your difference, and how we then navigate a world feeling like it's not necessarily meant for us, and that we're merely outsiders rather than invited into what it is to be human. Your A part of your awakening sort of connects to when you and I met, which is pretty rad. Right around that same time, when there were those incredibly powerful, massive protests, and I really felt the strength of support from the wellness community. And it's probably one of the few times that I had, because much of the wellness community is a white dominated, or are white dominated spaces. And specifically where I met you was a yoga studio in a white dominated space where I taught, and it was the only Black presenting, Black identifying teacher in that space, in a space that is known amongst yoga teachers of color to be dismissive, perhaps potentially, or not necessarily interested in making enough space for the BIPOC community. as an Asian American woman, how do you experience modern wellness in these wellness and spiritual spaces?
Oh, I feel very lucky to have had the privilege of creating my own spaces. Like I was part of that community for a while, and that really was in the beginning sort of the first place that I felt like I had found my yoga home. But I will say that studio was never the only spiritual community that I was a part of. I always hungered for more than what these white dominated spaces could offer. Um, and a richness that comes from honoring the full experience of what it means to be human. And so for me, like I feel like I have intentionally now divested from a lot of those spaces, but but I have experienced being harmed by them. I have experienced trying to talk to folks about creating change. And I want to acknowledge that like everybody has a different level of capacity for, and also a different audience for who they want to kind of bring onto this work. And for me, I realized like in 2018, sort of my audience that I want to serve is the Asian women community, and also I want to be part of BIPOC spaces. Um, I find that, and I say that I'm lucky because I had a network to do that with. And I want to recognize that many of us who come into spiritual or wellness spaces come because we have a hunger to heal, a hunger to be seen, a hunger to build a life that is more than what we were ever told is possible. And that is such a valid hunger that needs to be fed somewhere. And sometimes the only places available to you to feed that are unfortunately white dominated spaces. And I want to name that like it can be hard to like find your community. Like I mean, thankfully we have the internet now, which helps a lot. But like we were in a pandemic and we are continuing to be in a pandemic. And so um pros and cons of that. But I think that like with the proliferation of Instagram, I find that there are so many more BIPOC led wellness spaces, spiritual spaces to be part of. And in the creation of like the Cosmos, for example, which is the community that I've built for Asian women. It has a spiritual and wellness angle to it. I wouldn't say it's like the dominant thing because what we do is we help Asian women work on their identity, care for their internal world, and in order to create the external world, the world they most want to live in, which you could say is spiritual work, but like that's I think each person sort of defines that for themselves. But for me, it was always important to create that because I hungered for a space where my identity could be centered because there was just so much unpacking that I felt like I needed to do personally, and I wanted to be around other people who were able to do it with me. Um, so I guess all of this to say that the pandemic made it easy for me to step away from sort of those final white dominated spaces I had been part of. And it almost made the decision easy because I think prior to the pandemic, it felt so personal. Like if I were to leave, it would be taken personally and I think it would have been awkward. But now with the pandemic, and just given the fact that we've all had to deal with so much trauma in our personal and collective lives, it's almost like the ocean wave came in and just now the shore is clean and we get to rebuild in a way that feels authentic and aligned. And I've been so grateful to just fill my life, I think, with BIPOC who understand. I personally am not someone who has the desire to spend my energy, resources, time, emotional labor educating white folks. And I know that's also probably because of my own trauma. I'm not in a place where I'm not gonna be not triggered. And so given that, I feel most effective and most helpful, most supportive being around other BIPOC and creating space for Asian women.
So much of what you
Um,
said reminded me of my own experiences. And I think a lot of those experiences really does attack your sense of safety and security. And I didn't even know that that is what it was until, you know, I went on my healing journey and I saw a therapist and started that journey. And I sought out healing in the first place because of the generational trauma of my parents coming to America as immigrants, and then them just not being around, and my sister and I having to like I'm laughing just to make light of the situation, but basically having to raise ourselves and not really having people around us to, you know, tend to our emotions. And I'm a Korean American, so I don't know what it's like for the Vietnamese culture, but we were completely gaslit of our emotions. Like emotions just did not exist in our culture. So when you are going through that healing journey and you are healing your trauma, generational, and also what you experience as a BIPOC person, and then you go into these spaces where you want community, you want people to really make you feel safe and secure, to then be told that all lives matter, that racism doesn't exist, and that they don't see color, that is just completely erasing your entire experience as a person and what makes you the person that you are. And I'm an Aries sun, so I took the different approach. I was very combative, I was very angry, I would throw punches back, and my healing has been transmuting all of that anger to not be violent with my words and with my behavior, but more transmuting it in creativity and with creating change. And that's why Britt and I are doing this podcast, because it was really a way for me to channel all of this frustration within the communities that I was a part of, and having to hear people say harmful things like, you know, you all heard the rhetoric by now, I don't have to repeat it, but I'm just curious, like, because you created your own group, which I feel a lot of BIPOC people tend to feel that they have to do because they are not seen in these spaces. But I'm just wondering if then, if we all just created our own spaces, that creates echo chambers where now we are, you know, the Asians are here, you know, the Blacks are here, the Hispanics and whites. um, do you ever see a moment where we need to like be in these groups together and like have these conversations together? And maybe that is not what the cosmos is for, that maybe that's not what my community is for, but just interested in your thoughts in that.
Yeah. Before I jump into that, I just realized one thing about Britt's question. The other thing that's triggering for me is that so many of the practices in wellness and spiritual spaces that are white dominant come from Asia. So it's got that extra lens of like you are extracting and exploiting and culturally appropriating an entire continent and not willing to recognize that, and also telling us that like, you know, you don't see color and all of these things. So it's like the level, the sophistication of like the lies and the gaslighting and like the dishonesty is so intense, and it creates a really like toxic environment, even if they're not actively being harmful in their words. The way that that space is held, the culture that's there, is already harmful. um, I At the end of this human experiment and journey, I believe that I do believe that separation is an illusion. And where I'm at in my journey right now is recognizing that like the we are all equally affected by, and well, not equally, we're all affected by the trauma of white supremacy. Like I recognize that, and I recognize that I believe that white folks also have their own trauma that they have not worked through. And this is where I really want to name the work of Resmaa Menakem and his book My Grandmother's Hands. It's a book on racialized journey, and he has a chapter where he talks about how white folks have not reckoned with the history of violence that has been in their lineage for so long. Like, if I mean, he talks about the Middle Ages and even before that, like ancient Rome, right? People used to go to the Colosseum and see other people get ripped up in battle, or like whether it's animals against man or like man versus man, but people used to watch brutal killings as a sport. And then you go to like the creation of the guillotine, and like there used to be public executions all throughout Europe. So white culture is rooted in violence, and it used to be white on white violence. And then as colonialism and they started going around the world and trying to settle in places and like claim lands as their own, that culture was passed on to other people. And what is happening right now is white folks have this trauma that, in terms of like when that event happened, it's so far divorced from like the generation that's alive now. But what that creates is like confusion for them, and they need to do the work of like tracing back, how has my lineage, my family been a part of this history, in order to find their own center of gravity and footing in this movement. Because if they do not do that work, they will continue to be violent as a result of their fragility or unwillingness to be uncomfortable. um, and the white nervous system is also very, I don't know another word for it, but fragile.
Fragile.
Yeah, fragile.
Sorry.
The white nervous system can't handle this like reckoning, because they haven't had to for so long. Whereas we have had generations of like, I mean, strength coming from having to survive through horrible, violent acts, and history just constantly repeating itself. And so that all of that work needs to happen, I think, among the white community before we can come to the table and have real conversations about change. I do think at the end, like, we are all connected in that, like, we suffer from Maya, the illusions of the mind. We suffer from trauma. We suffer from things that don't belong to us, that are intergenerational, and also things that do belong to us. I think that's a shared human experience. And I do believe that like this work requires all of us dismantling and rebuilding together. And I think in order for that work to feel safe and productive for historically marginalized and oppressed peoples, those who benefit from white supremacy must do the work of understanding their own trauma. Like, how can they make the political personal? That means they have to mine their own life experiences and look at, how have I been given privileges that have allowed me to not see and not feel and not understand this moment. So I think until that work is done at some like, critical mass, or even if like it's happening at the individual level, without that work being done, it will always be a power imbalance if we come together. And I don't know the perfect answer. Maybe it's we have to do both at the same time, like still meet and convene even though it's imperfect, and also each group working on healing their own trauma so that we can show up resourced enough for these conversations. But I guess the other thing too is like, I think white folks have to reckon with like, in this world where everything you've been given has been given to you based on whiteness being falsely placed at the top of like the hierarchy, that means you have to also be okay with giving up power that never really belonged to you. Because a world in which we're all included, taken care of, and seen as equal humans means that you cannot be superior anymore. And that is going to take, I think, white folks some work to orient around, because it is going to feel personal. It's going to feel like, oh, well, it's not my fault. I didn't create white supremacy, so why should I? It's like, yeah, and you benefit from it. And in this world where where you say that you want love to be sort of the dominant force, and where we all get to be equally human, that's what we have to do to balance out the scales. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it does. And I think that's why so many of these spaces are led by thin white women, because I think subconsciously or unconsciously, they're running through this capitalistic patriarchal paradigm of like lack mentality, of scarcity mentality, that if I leave this spot, I can't leave this spot because there's only one spot. I can't make room for people of color, women of color, because to truly move into that collective mindset of unity consciousness is inherently abundant. I really believe that what you said in the beginning of love, truly being in that frequency of love, is giving other people a chance at the seat of the table. And if you are dismantling your own patriarchal colonized mindset, that means giving people who don't look like you a seat at the table. And I oftentimes think that they don't, because they are invested in that system of lack.
Also ego, like major ego. Like white, I'm generalizing obviously, but like white women and white feminists are very problematic because of the embodied belief that, you know, in order to, it's the embodied belief that like because I'm a woman, like I'm somehow doing this better than a white man would. But like what they're still not grappling with is how white supremacy shows up. And it's not just about like whether there's a woman running a studio or like whatever. It's like how are those same structures of harm being replicated just now in a woman's body? So I think that's something that's really I see a lot in the wellness and spiritual world, because it tends to be more women and femmes, at least in the spaces that I have been in. And what I find harmful is like, if white women do not also hold themselves responsible and accountable to the collective, what we're unearthing in the collective, and continue to see themselves as victims of patriarchy, um, without honoring all the different intersectional identities that are harmed as a result of their continued holding on to the fact that like I'm also harmed by patriarchy. I don't think that we can have productive change. And I agree with you, Laura. It's like, yes, maybe set a seat at the table, but also like, what does it look like to decenter yourself? I would say like that's also really important.
Cassandra, there are a lot of there in the past has been a great amount of dissonance between different groups within the BIPOC space and within the BIPOC community. And my guess from the outside is really just because of, well, for starters, for the model minority myth. Can you speak to that and how that's echoed in your experience, or and even in relationship to wellness and spiritual spaces?
Yeah, there's so much work for us to all do all around. So white supremacy is not just a matter of like BIPOC versus white folks. Like it has been imbued in all of us. And how white supremacy works is that, it's created a black and white binary, where model minority myth has ensured that Asians are constantly experiencing racial triangulation, which means we pinball, ping pong, whatever you want to call it, back and forth on this black and white binary. Um, and it's interesting because there's like the black and brown, meaning like Latinx community, tends to be more closely aligned from the outside looking in activism movements. And historically, Asians have been consistently written out of activist history, in American history. And this is very much like intentional because white supremacy created the model minority myth so that Asians could be a racial wedge to create more scarcity amongst black, brown, and black and Latinx and Asian communities and indigenous communities. Because if there's one group that can be positioned, or can if one group can there can be a story around one group like being white adjacent, and I'm saying this in like air quotes, then it creates more scarcity, right, within the historically marginalized groups, and it creates more crabs in a barrel and more infighting, so that we're not able to look at the system that is screwing all of us. Um, so what that means is, and also I will say, anti-blackness has been perpetuated around the world by white supremacy. So every group has to work through anti-blackness as well as learning about how white supremacy has affected that specific group. And so as an Asian person, I have had to work through my own anti-blackness to figure out like where that comes from and overcome that, at the same time that I've had to reckon with what does it mean to be Asian, because it's not just my personal definition. Like, I am perceived in a certain way because of the systems in place. And the more that I actually learned about real Asian American history, aka like we barely get a paragraph in history books in like high school, and it's always about like the gold rush. So the more I learned about Asian American history, the more that I also got to learn about the solidarity that has historically been there between Black and Asian activists. And learning that has helped me to kind of orient myself around and make sense of this moment, which is like each group has obviously individual levels of racialized trauma, and also each group has been fed lies about each other to ensure that we're consistently fighting each other in order for a higher rank in the pecking order, when actually there shouldn't be any hierarchy at all. Like that's what we should be focused on dismantling. So it's I forget, like there's I think a Toni Morrison quote about how like all of this is like distraction, and we need to focus on what's keeping us apart, because what's trying to create or like enforce division is because if we actually all came together and built coalitions and saw our struggles as connected, that is going to change the system, and that is exactly what the system does not want to happen. So that's like, it's my belief that we need to do our personal level healing to understand our racial trauma so that we don't perpetuate it or enact it on others. And from that healing, I believe it's possible to see the interconnectedness. And some of that healing is going to be like reading, like more intellectual, but I think a lot of the healing is also at a bodied level. Like it, like coming, like racialized trauma comes down to nervous system levels. And can we foster a sense of like safety around people who don't look like us and don't have our experiences, so that we can even be open to conversations of solidarity.
Yeah. I was actually thinking about that when they were reporting about all of the Asian violence, the ones recently, not the ones that, have historically been happening, but all of the videos that they would be showing were Black on Asian crime. And I was just like, no. Like, yes, that happens, but I think the media, not to sound like conspiracy theorists, but like that is white supremacy in action, like pinning two groups against each other. And there is a reason why, the British used it, divide and conquer. There's so many more of us if we united to break down these systems, that's why they keep continually trying to, as Cassandra said, like pin us against each other. And I find also with the model minority myth to be so damaging, because Asian is not a monolith. Like there's 50 different countries, like 100 and something languages in Asian. Some Asians look Black, like, there's so many different kinds of Asians that I think it's also harmful to think that all Asians are rich and all Asians are lighter skinned, but you wouldn't know that unless you took the time to ask somebody their ancestry. Everyone just knows Chinese, Japanese, and there's so many different kinds of Asians. So anyway,
that's also the you bring up a good point, Laura, because a key part of what I realized in 2021 was how little anyone who's not Asian knows about Asian people. And this is not a dig on anyone particular. This is like a function of white supremacy. Like it's like there's a reason why most non-Asian folks can only identify like China, or assume people are Chinese, right, and just don't have knowledge of like all the other countries that are represented. And that also reinforces the perpetual foreigner stereotype, which not only Hollywood perpetuates, but like has been created and also was enforced by like immigration laws. Like the Chinese Exclusion Act is the only law that the US has ever had that specifically excludes a group based on their like racialized identity or ethnic identity. And so that the constant like, are we going to let Asians in or not? Okay, in and out, in and out. No, we have like a tenuous citizenship to America, and that's also led to strengthening this idea that we're perpetual foreigners. Like that's why we're constantly asked, like, do we speak English? Where do you come from?
Where are you from?
Where are you from?
Where are you really from?
Exactly, exactly. And even like well-intentioned people fall into this stereotype because it's just been so dominant throughout culture. And going back to the first question Britt asked about storytelling, this is why storytelling is really critical because until there are other stories that emerge that can overwrite the dominant one, that is what people will believe. So because we are viewed as perpetual foreigners, our it also enables like our suffering to not be viewed as part of this like very American struggle. Like we don't even belong here, right? Where do you belong? You could always go back to your country. So it's like a very heady cocktail that it's got a lot of complex layers, and I think that even Asian folks are, we're many of us did not grow up with this. So like I learned this stuff in the last like 6 years, and it's a privilege that I was able to learn it. There are a lot of people who still don't, just and this history is intentionally kept from us so that we will stay silent and small and assimilate and not ruffle feathers. um,
Well, also like culturally, sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
culturally, a lot of Asian cultures, we have like a collectivist mindset, and our elders and authority is, we don't question authority. We don't question, at least in Korean culture, I'll speak for Korean culture, we don't speak out. We don't speak against the law. We don't speak against our elders. Like I, I have I am like the weird like black sheep in my family because I talk back to my parents, but I think that's also why Asians have a stereotype where, a lot of during the Black Lives Movement that happened last summer, a lot of people were saying, well, where were the Asians then? And I think a lot of it was because of not ruffling feathers, not having their throat chakras cleared as well, culturally.
Yeah. I've thought about this for a long time, and I think that like I feel like other people projecting that onto Asians is like it's sort of like only a small piece of the picture. What I have been really interested in, clearly, and I haven't like studied this in like an academic rigorous way, but like at a grassroots way in the cosmos is like how has model minority myth and racial triangulation, as well as like the immigration histories of our families, how has that all shaped the Asian American nervous system? And from the thousands of Asian women I've spoken to in my work in the cosmos the last 3 years, I consistently see this pattern of like we've grown up looking outside of ourselves so much more than looking within, to not only for direction or guidance but like for cues of safety, like in a space, how should I show up, how can I shape shift in order to be safe here, or in order to position myself for a job opportunity. Like there's a very specific way that the Asian body it's constantly insecure in this country, because of how we're utilized as a racial wedge that has created a nervous system that looks very much and with hypervigilance of like how do I be. And so I think then in this moment where a lot of Asian folks are who care so much about being part of social change, we're also working through the trauma of like how do we do that when many Asian ways of being naturally, culturally, have been colored by social justice spaces as like bad, right? And so, like as an example, there's this like Lao Tzu quote, and also Bruce Lee talks about it too. But like water, right? Asian culture is very much about like be formless like water, or like water is strong in a way that's not honored in the West, right? Because the West is all about fire and
Mhm.
like weapons, but like water
And weapons.
weapons. Water, though, is powerful in a very different way because over time it can erode rocks. It like changes the land. But in this like rapid response, reactive world that is also very much rewarded by social media, right? Because as long as trauma is trendy, then the social media companies make a lot of money and they stand to benefit from us, from our struggle. But like watery ways of being are not really honored or like accepted as an acceptable way of showing up for social justice. And so I have been very curious about like how do we get like allow this conversation about like what does Asian American activism look like to get more complicated, because it is very complex. And so long as we like demonize Asians as just quiet and like afraid of saying something, I think that it will exclude people from exploring who and how they are, and how they can bring that fullest expression forth in service of the movement. And I mean this also for everybody. I think there's a lot of empaths, there's a lot of softer souls who
Mhm.
in this moment also feel like, unless I can be loud like other folks, like traditional activists, then I can't be impactful. And I think that's such a shame, because in this new world we need all of us and all of our superpowers to be part of this change.
Would you argue that because of everything that has happened and accumulated in the past, let's say 5, borderline 10 years or so, we've now begun to realize and come together as a community, and I mean BIPOC as a whole, so that in the very near, not so distant, somewhere between that future, we will be able to be more fire-like. But now, as we're coming as together as a collective, we are sort of eroding that process of slow erosion, similar to that of water, of the energy of water, but that we're building steam and there's heat, and eventually you'll feel more of our fiery nature as a collective. Would you agree or disagree?
I'm seeing so much solidarity. I mean, it's like what you're willing to see, right? I think like everything is imperfect. But if I choose to see what is working, then I do see so much solidarity is happening, so much, at least in the spaces I'm in, talk about what does a caring culture look like how do we be more trauma informed and how we show up with one another. So I see a lot of change that has already happened in the past year and a half, and a lot of cross racial solidarity. And I have felt that like so supported by like the Black community, for example, during like the rise in visible anti-Asian hate crimes, and especially after the Atlanta shooting. And that to me is like progress. And I feel like, our movements are always going to have multiple strategies. Like what I love about BIPOC or any marginalized group is that we're always living on multiple timelines. There's one timeline where we are oppressed and living in this reality, but we're always holding this other timeline where liberation is happening. It's not just possible, it's already happening in small and big ways, where abolition is possible, like all of these, where imagination will help us rebuild a new world. And so I feel like our strategy is so rich, and it's going to have multiple moving parts, and it needs that because white supremacy is a very well-oiled, well-instituted machine. And so it's going to be, I think, not just one sort of attack or whatever, but like multiple timelines, multiple movements, multiple groups coming at it from all different angles and dismantling it that way.
Oh, I love that. I love
Mhm.
the multiple timelines. And that's why I believe everyone, I mean, sometimes I get frustrated by this, but everybody has their own role and their own time of how they do this. Um, and I have to like remember that, because sometimes I'm like, why don't you see it? Hello, why aren't you like doing the work, right? And that's why Britt and I like titled this the work, because it's everybody needs to do it, like all hands on deck.
I would love to know what work you see that that white folks have to do, and what work you see that BIPOC as a collective have to do. If you could give like definitive, like this.
I would say for white folks, like, this is not about like us personally attacking you or us personally hating on you. I think that's like, I would encourage white folks to create some space for like self inquiry and dropping deeply into the questioning of like, and being willing to be uncomfortable and also ask like, where is the truth here? Because if clearly so many people are saying they're harmed, there is something here. So I would ask white folks to like invest in the work. There are a lot of incredible, whether it's like coaches, spiritual communities, educators, like DEI folks who are like putting out different forms of anti-racism, anti-blackness content. I would say invest in that. Like, It doesn't have to be expensive. It could start with a book. It could start with creating a little like reading group where you check in with each other, but like invest in the work because it is going to not only heal you, but it is going to deepen your relationships with any BIPOC person in your life. And it's going to cultivate more trust and intimacy for us to do this work together. And so this work is yeah, I don't like to treat it as like a pointing fingers, but like white folks, you deserve healing too. And it's gonna start by sitting down and getting really clear about like your lived experiences and how much of it comes from white supremacy and like learning about these things that we've all had to learn about. Um, so I would say that's it for white folks, to start that work, and to see it as healing. Not like you're not doing this to save the black people or whatever, right? You're doing this because your own liberation is incumbent on this. And I really believe that like making it a little selfish, and that starts with like recognizing how have you not been free under white supremacy too. That's real. Um, and then from that, the ways that you see that you're not free, you will also see how the rest of us are not free. And then you can join us, truly join us in this movement. And then I would say for BIPOC, we get to rest. We get to lay the fuck down. Like we get to work on, yes, like healing our trauma, like advocating for change. We are so well versed in overworking and prioritizing the movement over ourselves because you know what? Like there's always lives on the line. But that's the point, right? There's always lives on the line, and your life is also on the line here. And our sustainability, our longevity is critical, not just because we deserve to have full, beautiful, fully expressed lives, but like this change we want to see is generational. And the work that we do to orient ourselves around pleasure, rest, play, and joy ensures that we can also pass down pleasure, rest, play, and joy into our lineage, into our communities. But so long as we feel like, oh, we can't rest until racism is over, that is only going to ensure our imminent death. Sleep deprivation, and this is where I want to name the work of the NAP ministry, where Tricia Hersey shares that sleep deprivation is a racial and social justice issue, and rest as resistance is a framework for disrupting capitalism and white supremacy, because both of these together work to ensure that we never feel like we can take a break. And that is how we know that the systems have robbed us of our imagination, because our ability to rest is our ability to dream, is our ability to imagine and create a new future. Trauma will ensure that we can never see more than the tunnel that is our lives. So it's a practice. For many of us, it's going to feel really foreign and hard. I am on that journey right now. Many of us have never seen people in our family or lives have a relationship to rest or pleasure, but it is so, 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 so critical, because the work of freedom dreaming, which is not a word I'm making up, it's a word that comes from a lineage of social justice activists, but freedom dreaming is a practice. You can't practice that when you're tired and depleted and sick.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, you gave me like waves of emotion.
Yeah, I literally, well, we have two more. We have, Britt has one more question, but I just wanted to say one thing, that something that has been coming up with our own conversations with Brittany and I are like, white supremacy is not just in white people, it's in everybody. And I think the last people to wake up, in air quotes, to it are white people, because they can shut it off. They don't need to see it as prevalently as people of color. But white supremacy is literally killing our world. It's ingrained in the climate crisis. It's in how we use up all the resources of Mother Earth, our animals, our plants. It's literally in everything. And so I think if there is a reason for white people to do this work, if you are a climate person, if you care about plants, if you care about any of that stuff, that is all within the paradigm of white supremacy. So I just wanted to say that. And I just, one question before Britt asked the last question is, yesterday we were speaking to an Indigenous woman, and she doesn't use white supremacy, she just uses supremacy, because she feels that language is really important, and she doesn't necessarily want you know, like she wants it to be more inclusive. But I think this goes back to what we were saying in the beginning about fragility. So how much of that is like how much of the language should we be using in your opinion, like white supremacy versus like you know, pointing out the white man, and you know, how much is language important, do you think?
Oh, language is everything. The language we use is always a reflection of the values we hold as an individual, or as a collective, as a society. And like language is also constantly evolving, right? Like white supremacy is what we're using right now because it's probably the best fit, but it's never, it may change. There may be something else that comes out. And like, what we're talking about is like we're creating language and frameworks that are centering humans, and humans are constantly evolving. And so language is always kind of like a little bit behind, trying to capture
Mm-hmm.
the rapidity with which like we're evolving. I think language is important in the sense that it connotes to certain values. I think it's also important to name that whiteness is a construct, and so that's also where like this is not about, when we say, like when I, at least I'll speak for myself, when I say white supremacy or I'm talking about whiteness, I'm not talking about individual people. I'm talking about the way that their identity has been constructed, just as our identities have been constructed. Because the creation of whiteness automatically drew a line in the sand. Because then now you're either benefiting from whiteness or you're not. And that line in the sand also created um, the need for all other groups to define themselves against whiteness. And so, um, recognizing that whiteness is a construct, I think allows us all to look at it almost like as this third party that is
Mm-hmm.
infecting this country, as opposed to like my side versus your side. And I feel the same way about white supremacy, because if whiteness is a construct, then white supremacy is the framework upon which that construct sits. Um, and these things can get a little heady because it feels amorphous, but like that's where I think our personal experiences can like kind of fill in that skeleton and add color
Yeah.
to so that we can see how this is affecting people's everyday lived experiences. But um, I obviously don't know the Indigenous woman's perspective, and I don't have an opinion either way because I don't know her context. But I'm using white supremacy right now because it's something that I feel like in the mainstream we're starting to understand, and that we are culturally even able to see, some big corporations name it as white supremacy. I think is a step forward. It may be performative, but it's like, okay, like we are orienting around the fact that white supremacy is a thing. That means the needle has moved enough in the culture such that we can even name it. And naming it is critical before we can work on it. If we're not able to name it, we're not able to heal it or address it. So I think that's another way that language is very important because it names something as a problem, and that's how we get enough people on board to recognize that it's something that needs to be worked on.
Yeah. Because I find when I bring that word up, white supremacy and white privilege, it already makes white people like do, 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 like on the defensive mode, like shutting down 3, 2, 1, you know? Um, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Maybe that's also where like I find in order to have these conversations, how do we start in a human way? And obviously it depends on like what your relationship is to that person, but like what if we started that conversation with like what are some ways in which you have felt limited by white supremacy or whiteness, and I'm going to share the ways in which I have felt limited, and maybe that's a starting place to for both parties. For example, if you care to have this conversation in that way, to recognize like we're both experiencing harm or lack of freedom here. It's not about who's oppression Olympics, not about who's got a better experience. Like can we just understand we're both harmed, and can that be the starting place? Like, yeah, like I can understand the gloss over, because it automatically puts people into defense mode, right? Because our identity is the thing that our ego most wants to protect.
Mhm.
So I have found one way to do it is like, how do we both start talking about our personal experiences and put that on the table so that we can both see like the shared experience of harm.
It's so interesting that you talk about how whiteness is a construct, because One of the things I was never actually able to rectify was the proximity of Asia to Europe, and how that was a definitive factor for creating two different racialized groups, except that they're all part of the same continent. And there's like this imagined separation. And we see it on a smaller scale with it's Haiti and the Dominican Republic, right? Where anti-Blackness has made Haitians appear to be an entirely different group of people, but they're actually on the same island and very similar in there. And we create these differences that separate us, that make us feel better than, more evolved than, that invite supremacy and hierarchy. And, you know, as a child, you're never really able to make sense of that. You're only picking up from what the adults tell you because you trust the adults in your life. Why would they lie? Why would they be wrong?
Yeah.
I want to know what your message is for the world, Cass.
There is this quote, I'm forgetting who said it, but just as hope is a, how do I want to describe it? Okay, the quote is, cynicism is also a belief, just as hope is a belief. And I think that I want to name that because we live in a world where like logic or linear logic, skepticism, cynicism are posited as or treated as more rational and more truthful than intuition, than hope, than optimism, right? These things get colored as frivolous or like cute, like nice to have. There's so much suffering in the world, like that's childish. But hope is a practice, just as cynicism is a practice. And so I would ask people to think about, what are you willing to feed? Are you, because it is a choice. Like we can look at what's happening in the world and take it as, oh, nothing's ever going to change. But that is actually what the system wants. And another book recommendation I'll make is Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And in that book, he talks about how oppression is a pedagogy, how we are taught to internalize oppression. And so one way to start practicing freedom, to start practice freedom dreaming, is to recognize, where am I investing in cynicism and skepticism, which is also what I'm being sold by the news, by the media. And media is all, we don't have independent media anymore. Like it's not big media, at least. Most media is now owned by corporations, right? Wall Street Journal owned by Jeff Bezos. If we trace the money, we will see that there are vested interests in our media that bias and color what we have access to. And while freedom of the press is like a value in America, we get to question, how free is the press really when the person who owns it also has a vested interest in maintaining their billionaire status or whatever, right? So with that said, like, how is what we're consuming feeding either cynicism, skepticism, or hope and optimism that things can change? And checking with ourselves as to like, which belief system do I want to feed? We get to create the reality we want to live. And that reality matters, even if it feels like in the collective right now, things are not changing, right? But like, when you look at something from the bird's eye view at the collective, of course it looks like nothing's moving. But if you go down to ground zero, right, into those weeds, into the communities, into the grassroots, there is a lot that's happening. But it's just, there's so many moving pieces, right? And so that's why I feel like recognizing that we can create the reality, and maybe that reality starts small with your relationships, or with your workplace, or with your local neighborhood, or with your family. But like that reality and that new culture that you get to practice will bleed out. And so we are so much more powerful than we recognize we are, and we all affect each other. And so what are you willing to invest in, hope or cynicism?
I think that's a beautiful place to close. What are you investing in, hope or cynicism? Thank you so much, Cassandra, what a beautiful love letter to our collective. And I have like chills and I'm speechless.
This has been such a nourishing conversation.
Mhm.
Thank you.